Welcome to the dark. Hello. Welcome back. I'm so glad you're here. If this is your first time listening, welcome. Truly welcome. You've found a strange little corner of the universe, and I think you're going to feel right at home here, or at least, as close to home as one can feel when contemplating the vast and unknowable dark that stretches out beyond everything we've ever built, everything we've ever named, everything we've ever loved. Take a moment right now, just a small one, to settle yourself. Feel the weight of the place you're lying in. Feel the pillow beneath your head, the sheets against your skin, the slow rise and fall of your own chest. You are here. You are breathing. You are, for this moment, completely safe inside the comfortable smallness of wherever you happen to be. That smallness is important. Hold on to it as we go. Tonight I have 8 stories for you. 8 slow, strange, unsettling tales from the edges of human experience, or perhaps beyond them. These are not stories designed to shock you, not stories designed to make you leap from your bed in a cold sweat. No, these stories are designed to do something far more interesting, and perhaps far more dangerous. They are designed to make you wonder, to make the ceiling above you feel like a window rather than a wall, to make the darkness at the edges of your vision feel inhabited in ways you've never quite articulated before but have always suspected. They are, in the truest sense, stories for the night. Stories that belong to the hours between sleeping and waking, when the mind loosens its grip on the daylit world and allows stranger currents to move through it. The universe is approximately 13.8 billion years old. The observable portion of it stretches roughly 46 billion light-years in every direction from where you are lying right now. Within that observable universe, astronomers estimate there are roughly 2 trillion galaxies. The Milky Way alone, our own modest spiral-armed home, contains somewhere between 100 billion and 400 billion individual stars. Of those stars, the vast majority are orbited by planets. Conservative estimates suggest there may be 40 billion Earth-like planets in our galaxy alone. 40 billion. In our galaxy. 1 galaxy out of 2 trillion. Now, I want you to breathe with me for a moment. In through the nose slowly and out through the mouth even more slowly. Let your shoulders drop. Let your jaw unclench. Let your hands go soft. The question I want to plant in your mind before we begin, the question I want to leave there, nestled between the folds of your drowsing consciousness like a seed, is not whether there is other life out there in those impossible distances. That question feels increasingly quaint, almost naive the more you stare at the numbers. The question I want you to hold gently as you drift towards sleep tonight is this: what do they want? We've always assumed, when we've imagined contact, in our films, our books, our anxious late-night conversations, that any meeting between humanity and whatever lives out there would happen on our terms. That we would be the ones to reach out or to receive. That we would have some warning. That we would have some choice in the matter. But what if we've already been found? What if contact is not something that happens in the future, at some grand and televised moment of collective human readiness, but something that has been happening quietly and continuously for longer than we can comfortably imagine? What if the universe is not waiting for us to be ready? What if it has been watching and studying and touching the edges of our lives with fingers we can't quite see? These are the questions that live inside tonight's stories. They are not answered. I want to be clear about that. I am not going to give you resolution or explanation or closure. What I am going to give you is 8 long, slow descents into the feeling of those questions. 8 evenings spent inside the peculiar, specific, almost beautiful dread of not knowing. Some of you may find, as the stories unfold, that the dread becomes something else. Something that isn't quite fear and isn't quite comfort but occupies the strange, liminal territory between the two. That is exactly where these stories are meant to live. In that territory. In that in-between. Because the truth is, when we are honest with ourselves, truly honest in the way we can only be at night, when the performance of daytime certainty has finally dropped away, most of us already feel it. That sense. That low, persistent, unnameable sense that the universe is not empty, that we are not alone, that something, somewhere, is aware of us in the same way we might be aware of a small and interesting insect moving across a very large floor. Don't fight that feeling tonight. Let it come. Let it breathe. Let it carry you down. The stories are ready. The dark is waiting. Let's begin. The harvest fields of Crestwood County. Crestwood County sits in the center of a state that itself sits in the center of a country that sometimes seems to have forgotten it's there. It is the kind of place where the roads are perfectly straight for miles and miles and miles, where the horizon is a clean, unbroken line in every direction, where the sky at night is genuinely enormous in a way that city people find either sublime or quietly terrifying, depending on their temperament. The corn in Crestwood County grows tall. It always has. Farmers there will tell you, and they have always told you going back generations, going back as far as the county's agricultural records are kept, that the soil there is something special. Something in the mineral composition of the earth. Something in the particular quality of the light that falls across those flat, wide fields from late spring through early autumn. The yields from Crestwood farmland consistently outperform those from neighboring counties by margins that agricultural scientists have studied but never satisfactorily explained. The corn grows tall and it grows fast and it grows in patterns that, from ground level, are simply a dense, rustling green-gold labyrinth. But from above, from the cockpit of a small crop dusting plane, or from the satellite imagery that county extension agents use for their annual assessments, the patterns become visible. They have always been visible to anyone who looked carefully enough from the right angle and the right altitude. Curved furrows that don't quite align with the prevailing wind direction. Circular variations in the density of the growth, areas where the stalks are marginally taller and marginally more vigorous, arranged in configurations that seem, to some eyes, almost deliberate. Margaret Ellery had farmed her family's 400 acres in Crestwood County for 31 years when she first began to notice the sounds. This is her story, told as she told it to her daughter Clara on a warm September evening in the year before Margaret died. Sitting on the porch of the farmhouse with glasses of sweet tea going warm in their hands and the fields stretching out before them dark and vast and gently moving in the evening wind. "I want to tell you something," Margaret said. "Something I never told your father. Something I never told anyone. Because I knew how it would sound and I've spent 30 years deciding whether I cared more about being believed or about you knowing the truth. And I've finally decided on the truth." Clara set down her glass. Her mother had never spoken like this before. Not once in all her memory of her. Margaret was a practical woman, a silent woman, a woman who communicated in tasks completed and meals prepared and the particular quality of her attention when you were in a room with her. She was not a woman who made speeches. She was not a woman who said things like, "I want to tell you the truth." "The sounds started in my second year on this land," Margaret said. "Your father was traveling that week, some equipment conference in the city, and I was sleeping alone in this house for the first time in my adult life. I was 27 years old. I was not a frightened person. I had grown up on a farm. I understood that farmland at night makes sounds that farmland during the day does not make, because the absence of human activity allows you to hear what is always present but normally masked. The settling of buildings. The movement of animals through the brush at the field's edge. The irrigation systems cycling on and off. These things I knew. She paused and looked out at the fields. The corn was high that year. Almost unnaturally high, as it was almost every year in Crestwood County. A slight wind moved through it from the west and it hissed and whispered and leaned all in one direction, like something bowing. "What I heard that night was not any of those things," she said. "It was a frequency. That's the only word I have for it. Not a sound exactly or not only a sound. More like a pressure. A pressure that had a rhythm to it, very slow, very regular, about once every 4 or 5 seconds. I could feel it in my back teeth. I could feel it in my sternum. I lay very still in this bed and I listened to it for what I thought was maybe 20 minutes, but when I finally checked the clock was 3.5 hours, and the whole time I lay there I was absolutely certain, in the way you are certain of certain things in the absolute dark, that something was in the fields. Not moving through the fields, that would have made different sounds, sounds of disturbed stalks and displaced earth, but present in the fields, standing in the fields, multiple things, many of them, very still and very close together, covering, I somehow knew this, most of the acreage in a grid pattern that I couldn't have drawn for you then but that I can see now when I close my eyes as clearly as if it were a map I've memorized. Clara did not speak. The evening insects sang in the grass around the porch. A moth moved in slow loops around the porch light above their heads. "In the morning," Margaret said, "I went out to look. I took the ATV out along the field rows and I looked and I looked and I found nothing. No tracks. No marks in the soil. No damage to the crop. Nothing to suggest anything had been there. And the yield that fall from those fields was the highest I've ever recorded. 18% above the previous year. I filed the paperwork with the county extension office and they said, "Wonderful, well done." And I went home and I sat in this kitchen and I thought about what I had heard and felt and known in the absolute dark of that September night, and I thought, something out there is helping this crop grow. Something has been helping this crop grow. Something has been helping this land produce for a very long time. Margaret lifted her tea and drank, slowly, looking out at the corn. "After that I started paying attention differently," she said. "I started keeping a log. Not a farm log. I had those, I've always kept those. A different log, a private one, in a notebook I kept in the locked drawer of my desk. I logged the nights when I heard the frequency, the duration of it, the approximate area of the fields it seemed to be centered on. Over 31 years I filled 4 notebooks with these logs. And what I found was a pattern. The frequency occurred, on average, 3 to 4 times per growing season. It was always at night, always between the hours of 2 and 5 in the morning. It was always followed within 48 hours by measurable improvements in crop health in the adjacent fields. Faster growth, fuller kernel sets, resistance to blight and insect pressure that could not be accounted for by anything I had applied to the soil." She set her glass down, folded her hands in her lap, looked at her daughter. "I want to be clear about something," she said. "I was never afraid. Not after that first night. I was never afraid because of something I realized slowly, over many years, listening to that frequency in the dark. It was not indifferent to me. That's the word I keep coming back to. It was not indifferent. I had the sense, and I know how this sounds, I had the very clear and persistent sense that whatever produced that frequency knew I was there. In that bed. In this house. It knew I was there, and it was not threatening me, and it was not interested in me. Not in the way of a predator or a scientist or something that wanted something from me specifically. But it knew I was there the way I know when one of the cats is sleeping in a corner of a room I'm in. A background awareness. A registered presence. Clara looked at the fields for a long time before she spoke. "Do you think it was protecting you?" she asked. Margaret thought about this carefully, in the way she thought about everything. "No," she said at last. "I think we are incidental. I think we have always been incidental. I think something has been working this land, our land, all the land in this county, all this flat and open and accessible land, for purposes that have nothing to do with us at all. And I think the good yields are not a gift. They are a side effect. The same way a forest is healthier in the vicinity of certain fungi, not because the fungi care about the forest, but because the forest is part of the fungi's work, the fungi's larger project, whatever the fungi need the forest to be." She stood up slowly and looked out one last time at the corn. "I want you to keep the notebooks," she said. "After I'm gone, I want you to keep them. Not to do anything with them. Just to know. Just so someone knows." The wind moved through the crestwood fields, and the corn whispered and the frequency. If you were very still, if the night was quiet enough, if you lay in the old farmhouse bed with your eyes closed and your mind open, was there, just barely, just at the edge of hearing, regular and deep and patient as the turning of the world. Clara kept the notebooks. She keeps them to this day, in a locked drawer of her own desk, in the farmhouse she now owns and farms alone. She has never opened the 4th notebook all the way through. She has read the early entries, her mother's neat, unhurried handwriting describing the frequency and the feeling of it, the maps she made of where she believed the presences to be distributed across the fields, the yield records noted in adjacent columns as if the connection between the two needed no commentary, because it didn't, not to Margaret, not after 30 years of cross-referencing the two with the silent, methodical attention of a scientist who has decided that her primary obligation is to the truth of what she is observing rather than to the reception of that truth by anyone else. Clara farms the same land her mother farmed. The yields are still extraordinary. In drought years when neighboring farms struggle, the Ellery acreage produces as reliably as if the weather were indifferent to it. In wet years it doesn't flood. In seasons of fungal pressure it resists. Agricultural scientists have visited, twice in the years since Margaret died, and come to no conclusion that satisfies any of them. The soil data is unremarkable. The drainage is good but not exceptional. There is no obvious explanation for the consistent outperformance that has been documented in county records for as long as county records have existed. Clara sleeps in her mother's bedroom now. In the first year she lived there alone, she heard the frequency 3 times. She has not told anyone about this. She lies in the old bed in the deep rural dark and she feels it move through her, in her back teeth, in her sternum, exactly as her mother described, and she does not reach for her phone, does not turn on a light, does not do anything at all except breathe, slowly, and be present to it, and feel it move through the fields below her in its grid pattern that she cannot draw for you but that she knows in her body the way she knows the shape of her own hands. She added a 5th notebook of her own. She uses her mother's notation system. The entries are brief, factual, exactly like her mother's. The frequency, the duration, the approximate field coverage. The subsequent yield data. She stores it in the same locked drawer beside the other 4, and she understands, in the way that her mother understood, that this record is not for anyone in particular and is also for everyone, in the fullness of time, when the time is full enough, when whatever is working this land has finished its work and the nature of that work becomes something that can be spoken about in full light, in the world, in the language of the understood. Until then, the corn grows. The frequency visits. The notebooks fill one careful entry at a time, in the dark of a farmhouse on 4,800 acres of the best producing soil in Crestwood County, in the center of a state that sits in the center of a country that has forgotten it's there, under a sky that, on clear nights, shows you more stars than you can count and makes you feel, if you let it, like the universe is very large and very close and is paying, whether you want it to or not, a certain kind of careful and impersonal and perpetual attention. Something in the fields is tending. It does not need you to understand why. It only needs the season to be right and the darkness to be complete. The pale visitors of Millbrook Lake. Millbrook Lake is the kind of lake that looks, in photographs, as though someone has placed a mirror on the ground and let it reflect everything above it with a fidelity that feels slightly wrong, slightly too perfect, as if reality has been doubled in a way that undermines itself. The water is very clear and very dark at the same time, which is a combination that is more common in deep lakes than people tend to realize but which, at Millbrook, feels particular and intentional. The summer community around Millbrook Lake has existed for a little over 90 years. There are 47 camps and cottages ringing the shoreline, most of them built in the 1930s and 1940s, a few older than that, and several dozen more modern structures that nevertheless manage to feel apologetic about their modernity in a place as clearly devoted to an older way of living as Millbrook. The people who summer there tend to come from the same families, generation after generation. Names carved into dock posts in 1947 are still the names of the families who appear each June and depart each August, as reliable and seasonal as the loons. The thing about Millbrook that the summer people know but do not discuss, not with outsiders, not in the full light of day, not in the cheerful, wine-accompanied social evenings that are the social currency of the lakeside community, is the figures. They have always been there. Or rather, they have always been seen, which is not exactly the same thing. They appear at the water's edge on certain nights in July and August, always between the hours of midnight and 3 in the morning, always on nights when the moon is not visible and the lake is at its most perfectly reflective. They stand very still, at the exact line where the water meets the shore in groups of 3 to 7, and they are pale, very pale, pale in a way that has nothing to do with skin tone or pigmentation but rather seems to be a quality of the light that falls on them, or perhaps a quality of the light that comes from them. A paleness that is its own light source. A paleness like moonlight in a jar. The Peterson family, who have summered at Millbrook for 4 generations, have a tradition. On the last night of every summer, the oldest person in the family who has ever seen the figures, whoever that currently is, sits with the youngest person who is old enough to understand, and tells them what they know. This tradition has been passed down for so long that the original circumstances of its establishment have been lost. The Petersons do not know who first decided this was necessary. They only know that it is. This is the telling that Evelyn Peterson, 83 years old and the family's uncontested matriarch, gave to her great-granddaughter Josephine, 11 years old, on the last night of the summer of a recent August, sitting together on the dock in the hour before midnight, their feet dangling over the dark water. "I first saw them when I was 9 years old," Evelyn said. "Your great-great-grandmother brought me out to see them, the way her mother had brought her out, the way I am bringing you now." She told me not to be afraid, and because she said it with such absolute calm, the way she said everything, your great-great-grandmother, she was the calmest person I've ever known. I found that I was not afraid, or that the fear I felt was manageable, something I could hold without dropping. The lake was very still around the dock. The frogs that had been singing in the reeds had gone quiet, which was one of the signs Evelyn had told Josephine earlier that the night was right. They come out of the water, Evelyn said, or they come to the water. I have never been able to determine which. I have watched many times over many years, and I cannot tell you whether they emerge from the lake or whether they approach it from the tree line. They simply appear at a certain moment, at the water's edge, as if the question of where they came from is one the universe has decided not to answer. Josephine pulled her knees to her chest and looked at the far shore, where the tree line was a black serration against the slightly less black sky. What do they look like? She asked, which was the traditional question, the question every child in the Peterson family had asked at this point in the telling. They look like us, Evelyn said, in the way that a reflection in water looks like the thing being reflected. The proportions are approximately right. Two things that function as arms. Something that functions as a head. They stand upright. They face the lake. But the details that make a person, the individual features, the particular way a specific body holds itself, the textures of hair and clothing and expression, those details are not there. Or rather, they are there in a way that the eye cannot quite complete. Like looking at a word in a dream that keeps almost resolving into legibility. She paused. The lake had gone so still that it was hard to tell where the water ended and the sky began. They do not speak, she continued. They do not move while you are watching. In all my years of watching, I have never seen them move. They are always still when you first see them. They are always still while you observe them. But, and this is the part one want you to understand, Joe, the part that took me many years to accept. When you look away, when you blink, when your eyes lose them for even a fraction of a second, they change position. Not dramatically. A slight rotation. A shift of a few inches. A reorientation toward the water or away from it that could not have happened smoothly while you were watching, but that has unmistakably happened in the interval between your looking and not looking. Josephine stared out at the dark water. What are they doing? She asked. Evelyn was quiet for a long time. Your great-great-grandmother had a theory, she said at last. She thought they were counting. She thought they came to the lake, to this lake, and perhaps to other lakes, other bodies of still water that can do what water does in darkness, which is hold a reflection of the sky. She thought they came to count, to take inventory of what, she didn't know, of us perhaps, of the stars above us, of the distance between the sky and its reflection on the water's surface, of something that requires stillness and darkness and a place where above and below briefly become indistinguishable. The frogs were still silent. The lake was still perfect. And then, on the far shore, in the exact line between water and earth, in the complete dark beneath the tree line, they were there. 3 of them, pale as paper, pale as bone, pale as the inside of something that has never known light, standing at absolute attention at the water's edge, facing the lake, facing their own reflections with what could not quite be called focus but was something in that direction. Josephine breathed very slowly and said nothing. Beside her, Evelyn reached out and took her great-granddaughter's hand. Don't blink, she said gently, the way she said everything. Try not to blink. Josephine stared. The figures stood at the far shore, perfect and still and white as a thought that hasn't been thought yet. The lake between them was so still it made no sound at all. The sky above was dense with stars that the water below duplicated exactly, so that it became genuinely impossible to say which stars were real and which were reflection, which sky was the one you lived beneath and which was the one that existed only in the lake's patient, dark remembering. Many minutes passed, then many more. Josephine's eyes burned. She blinked once involuntarily, the way you always do when you try hardest not to. When she opened her eyes, the far shore was empty. The lake held its reflection of the stars. Evelyn squeezed her hand and said nothing because nothing needed to be said, and they sat together on the dock until the frogs began to sing again, which meant it was over for another summer, and in another year there would be another night just like this one, and the lake would be waiting as it always waited, and the figures would return, as they always returned, to count whatever it was they came to count. The lake remembers everything it reflects. The question is whether it shows those memories to the right eyes. Static. Daniel Voss had been listening to radio static for 11 years by the time the static began listening back. He was not a scientist. He was not, in any formal or credentialed sense, a researcher. He was a 54-year-old high school mathematics teacher in a small city in the Pacific Northwest who had, in the years following his divorce, developed a hobby that he understood was eccentric and that he kept to himself with the comfortable self-knowledge of a person who has made peace with his peculiarities. He built radio receivers. He tuned them to the spaces between stations, to the frequencies where there was no human transmission, and he listened on headphones in his study late at night for what some people called the hum, what others called background electromagnetic noise, what Daniel himself called privately the texture of the universe. He kept meticulous logs of what he heard, the variations in the noise, the occasional organized seeming bursts of signal that appeared within it, the patterns that seemed to emerge and dissolve like faces in clouds. He had never found anything definitive. He had never expected to. The hobby was not about finding anything. It was about the listening itself, the long, patient, solitary act of attention that had, since his marriage ended, become his primary relationship with the world. On a Tuesday night in November, 11 years into this practice, Daniel was listening on a frequency in the mid-range shortwave band when the static changed. He could not have said exactly how it changed, not at first. The sound was still fundamentally static, the broad, rushing, oceanic sound of ambient electromagnetic noise that he had come to know the way you come to know the sound of your own house at night, every creak and tick and settling, so intimately that a new sound registers not as a sound but as an absence of familiarity, a place where the known pattern breaks. This was how he knew something was different. Not because he heard a new thing, because the old thing had shifted in a way that made him suddenly very aware that he was hearing it. He turned up the gain slightly. He adjusted the tuning by a fraction of a kilohertz. He leaned forward in his chair. In his study at 11:40 in the evening, with the lamp making its small circle of warmth in all that darkness, he listened. The texture of the static had changed. That was the only way to describe it. The way the grain of wood changes as you run your finger along it, from smooth to rough and back again. The static had a grain now that it hadn't had before, a directionality, a sense of organization at a scale just below the resolving power of his equipment. Like trying to read text through several layers of frosted glass, you could not make out the letters, but you could tell there were letters. You could tell something was organized. Something was deliberate. He sat with it for 4 hours. He recorded everything. He drank 2 cups of coffee and ate nothing and forgot entirely that his body was a thing requiring maintenance, because the mathematics teacher in him had recognized something. The grain of the static was not random. It had periodicity. Very faint, very complex, probably undetectable to anyone not trained to look for pattern in numerical sequences, but there, a recurring structure in the noise with a period of approximately 41 seconds, internally complex, never quite repeating identically but clearly related to itself in the way that variations on a theme are related to the theme. He began to transcribe, as best he could, the fluctuations in signal strength within each period. He numbered them. He organized them into columns. He stared at the columns for an hour before recognizing what he was looking at. A base 7 counting system. Not human. Not any human number system he was aware of. But the logic was unmistakable once you saw it. An incrementing sequence in base 7, cycling through approximately 300 units before resetting and repeating with slight variations that themselves formed a higher-order pattern he couldn't immediately parse. He sat with this recognition for a long time. He was a careful man, precise man, a man who had, over 11 years of listening to static, taught himself a great deal of humility about pattern recognition, about the human brain's extraordinary and frequently misleading tendency to find structure where only randomness existed. He tested his transcription against other hypotheses. He rechecked his methodology. He sat with the data and turned it over and pushed on it the way he would push on a mathematical proof, looking for the place it broke, the place where a simpler explanation became available. No simpler explanation appeared. At 4 in the morning, still in his chair, headphones still on, the static still filling his ears with its new, organized grain, Daniel Voss did something he had never done in 11 years of listening. he transmit back. It was a small thing. A simple thing. He connected a small transmitter to his setup. He had the equipment, he had always had the equipment, though he had never used it for this. And on the same frequency, in a brief, careful sequence, he transmitted 7 pulses. 1 pulse. Then 1 and 2. Then 1 and 2 and 3. A demonstration, he thought. An offering. A way of saying, I see you. I recognize a counting sequence. I can count too. He sent the sequence and then sat back and listened and was very still. The static continued for about 20 seconds. Then it changed again. The periodicity shifted. The base 7 counting sequence folded itself into something new. Not a response exactly, or not only a response. More like a recalibration. As if whatever was on the other end of the frequency had received his 7 pulses and had used them to adjust something. Had used his transmission as a reference point, a unit of comparison, a key to something it had been unable to previously resolve. The new signal was more complex. Much more complex. And in its complexity there was something that Daniel, who had spent his adult life teaching the emotional language of mathematics to teenagers who often believed mathematics had no emotional language at all, recognized with a cold certainty that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with the gut. Interest. The signal communicated interest the way a face communicates interest. Not because faces and signals share a vocabulary, but because interest is a fundamental state of attending that certain configurations of information, regardless of their medium, manage to convey. Something was interested in him now. Something was paying attention to him in a way it hadn't been before he transmitted. Before he transmitted, he had been incidental, a part of the environment through which the signal was passing. Now he was a subject. Something had noted him. He thought about this for a long time, sitting in his chair in the small circle of lamplight with the November dark pressing against his study windows and the signal continuing, patient and complex and attentive, in his ears. He thought about whether he should transmit again. He thought about what he would transmit if he did. He thought about what it meant that something in the dark, something at an unknowable distance and of an unknowable nature, now knew he was there and was interested in the fact of him. He did not transmit again that night, or the following night, or the night after that. But on the 4th night, when he put his headphones on and turned to the frequency, the signal was waiting. The base 7 sequence, cycling patiently, as if it had simply continued on through his absence and was continuing still and would continue whether or not he was listening. Patient, present, complex, waiting. He was never sure afterward, never sure in the way that would have satisfied a scientist or a lawyer or anyone who required certainty as a condition of belief, whether what followed was the beginning of something or the middle of something that had always already been underway. Whether his response had initiated a contact or simply made him visible within a contact that had been in progress for a very long time, that had been in progress before he picked up a radio, before he was born, before the human species had the concept of a radio at all. But every night that fall and every night that winter, Daniel Voss sat in his study with his headphones on and the static in his ears, and something sat with him. Something counted. Something paid attention to the counting. And in the long, cold, illuminated dark of those Northwest nights, the mathematics teacher who had been listening to silence for 11 years listened to something that was not silence and understood, slowly and with a kind of wondering dread, that the universe had been counting all along, had been counting and cataloging and attending to its inventory of inhabited points, of places where something listened and responded, and that he had simply, finally, tuned to the right frequency to hear. In doing so, the following spring, Daniel retired from teaching. He told his colleagues it was time, that he was 65 and had given enough years to the classroom, that he wanted to travel, rest, pursue his interests. This was all true and also not the whole truth. The whole truth was that the signal had changed in January of that year, and the change had made it impossible for him to give his full attention to anything else. In January, the periodicity had shortened. Not dramatically, from approximately 41 seconds to approximately 37, but consistently, measurably, in a way that his recordings confirmed across 3 separate nights of listening. Then in February it had shortened again to 34 seconds. The base 7 counting had remained, the higher order patterns had remained, but the tempo had increased and was increasing, and Daniel, who had been listening to this signal for 4 months and had, in that time, come to understand its rhythms the way you come to understand the rhythms of something you live with, found the acceleration troubling and also thrilling and also impossible to look away from. He spent his retirement in his study. He upgraded his equipment with money from a savings account he had been building for 20 years and never had a particular plan for. He improved his recording fidelity. He corresponded carefully and obliquely with two other amateur radio operators who had noticed anomalous signals in the shortwave spectrum and who described, in their own vocabulary and with their own uncertainties, observations that overlapped meaningfully with his. He did not tell them the full extent of what he had found. He was not sure they were ready, and he was not sure he was ready either to say fully what needed to be said. The signal continued to accelerate through the spring. By May it was running at periods of just under 30 seconds. By August it was at 26. It had developed, or he had developed the equipment to perceive, a new structural layer, a third-order pattern nested within the first two, extraordinarily complex, that he was nowhere near parsing, but that the part of his mind that taught himself mathematics in the long hours between sleeping and waking recognized, dimly and with a growing astonishment, as something that might be, in its own architecture, something like a language. Not a human language. Not a language in any sense he had the tools to approach. But a structured system of information that had internal grammar, that had something functioning like syntax, that was organized the way communication is organized rather than the way noise is organized. He sat with this alone in his study in the city in the Pacific Northwest, and he thought about what it meant to be, as he had come to understand himself, a terminal, a receiving end. A place where information arrived that had originated at an incomprehensible distance and had been traveling, possibly for longer than the human species had existed, toward something, some threshold of sufficient receiving capacity, some moment of sufficient attention and sufficient technical means, some ear that was capable, finally, of hearing it clearly enough to know what it was. He was not sure he was that ear. He was not sure the equipment he had built in a study in a small house in a mid-sized city was sufficient to the task the signal seemed to be arriving for. But he was what was here. He was the receiver that had found the signal, or that the signal had found. He was no longer certain which, and he sat in his chair in the dark and he listened, and the signal spoke in its accelerating, complex, alien mathematics, and he witnessed it, which was the only thing he knew how to do and which he had decided was enough, was in fact a great deal, was perhaps exactly what was needed from him, and nothing more and nothing less. The static never stops. It was there before the first radio. It will be there long after the last one. It is patient in the way that only very large things can be patient. The cartographer of dead worlds. Dr. Yusra Osman had been drawing maps of places she had never been since she was 4 years old, which was when her mother, noticing that her daughter was covering the margins of every book in the house with dense, careful diagrams of landmasses and coastlines that looked nothing like any geography on Earth, quietly began saving those scraps and margins in a shoebox that she kept under her bed and that she gave to Yusra, tearfully, on the day Yusra left for graduate school in planetary cartography. By the time Yusra was 38, the shoebox had been joined by 12 filing cabinets for external hard drives and a leather-bound portfolio that she kept on a shelf above her desk and never opened in front of anyone, because the maps inside it were of places that, as far as the current instruments of planetary science could determine, did not exist. She was the leading planetary cartographer at a major space science institute. She had mapped, with extraordinary precision, over 60 confirmed exoplanet surfaces using the combined data streams of multiple space telescope arrays. She was exceptional at her work in a technical sense. Her ability to synthesize partial and low-resolution data into coherent topographical models was well documented and frequently cited. But her colleagues, if they were being fully honest, would have acknowledged that there was something about Yusra's maps that went beyond technical proficiency. They were too accurate. Not in minor ways. Minor exceeding of expectation was simply excellence. But in ways that were, when later data arrived to confirm them, statistically improbable to the point of demanding explanation. The maps she drew of exoplanet surfaces, based on transit photometry data and atmospheric spectroscopy, routinely contained topographical details that should not have been resolvable from available data. Mountain ranges, rift valleys, the signatures of ancient impact structures. These features, when subsequent higher-resolution imaging confirmed them, were exactly where Yusra's maps had placed them, with a precision that her colleagues attributed to intuition and she attributed, privately, to something she had no category for. She told her closest friend, a woman she had known since graduate school, the truth, once. Late on a work trip, In a hotel bar in a European city neither of them could quite remember the name of in the morning. She told her what it was like, what it actually felt like, from the inside. I don't derive them, she said. That's what I want you to understand. I run the derivations. I do the math. I check everything against the available data. But the map exists before any of that. The map is just there. When I start a new planetary body, before I've even loaded the data into the modeling software, I already know what the map is going to look like. It's already in my head, complete, like a memory of a place I've been. And then I do the science, and the science confirms the memory, and I don't know what that means, but I know it means something. Her friend looked at her for a long time across the hotel bar table. Do you think you've been there? She asked. Yusra shook her head slowly. I think someone has, she said. I think the information exists somewhere. I think I'm receiving it. Somehow. I think I have always been receiving it. Since I was a small child making maps of places no one had discovered yet. I think I am some kind of terminal. A place where information arrives that originated elsewhere. That's terrifying, her friend said. Yes, Yusra said. It is. But the maps are beautiful. The leather portfolio above her desk at the institute contained, among other things, detailed topographical maps of 43 planetary bodies that had not yet been identified by any telescope. She kept them because she had learned, over the years, that they would eventually correspond to confirmed discoveries. She had learned this because 3 of the maps she had drawn before the age of 12, maps she had carried with her through graduate school, rolled and rubber-banded at the bottom of a moving box, treasured more as totems than as documents, had turned out to correspond with eerie precision to 3 confirmed exoplanets identified in the following decades by space survey missions. She did not tell anyone about the portfolio. She understood that the information it represented, wherever it came from, whatever its origin, was something the world was not quite ready to receive in the form she could offer it. She understood this the way she understood the maps. Not through reasoning but through a kind of prior knowing, as if the understanding had arrived complete from the same source as everything else. There was one map in the portfolio that she found herself returning to more than any other. A large, carefully detailed world, roughly 1.3 times the diameter of Earth, with 2 large equatorial supercontinents separated by a global ocean. A world with an extensive system of rivers on the larger continent, feeding into a series of shallow inland seas. A world that bore, in the high northern latitudes, a pattern of geometric regularity in certain terrain features, straight lines, perfect arcs, configurations that could be natural but that the part of Yusra that she had learned to trust with absolute fidelity said were not natural, said were constructed, said were the infrastructure of something that had built and organized and shaped its environment in the way that a civilization shapes its environment. The map was dated in her own handwriting, in the handwriting of her childhood, her neat and early developed cursive. She had drawn it when she was 6 years old. She had drawn it the way you draw something you remember. She had never found it in the sky. Not yet. She had been looking for 32 years, cross-referencing the map's features against the growing catalog of confirmed and candidate exoplanets, waiting for the match that she knew, in the particular and unshakable way she knew everything she knew about other worlds, would eventually arrive. She was not afraid of what she would find when it did. She had moved past fear of this particular thing a long time ago because fear requires uncertainty, and she had, about this, no uncertainty at all. What she felt, instead, was the specific, patient, burning emotion of someone who has been carrying a message for a very long time and is waiting, simply and completely, to find the person it was meant for. The maps we make of far places may already be memories. The question is whose? Below the ice. The Amundsen 3 research station sits on the East Antarctic ice sheet at an elevation of approximately 3,200 meters above sea level, in a location chosen for its proximity to a subglacial lake that had been identified by ice-penetrating radar surveys as unusually large and unusually deep, with a thermal signature that suggested liquid water had persisted there, sealed beneath 2 kilometers of ice, for somewhere between 15 and 30 million years. The station was staffed year-round by a rotating team of 6 to 12 researchers. In the winter months, when the sun dropped below the horizon and did not return for 3.5 months, the complement was reduced to the minimum viable crew. 6 people in a world of complete darkness and temperatures that dropped, in the worst weeks, to below -60 degrees Celsius. The drilling program had been in operation for 4 years when the drill reached the lake. This was a major scientific milestone. The papers had been written in anticipation, the protocol for contamination prevention had been tested and retested. The team that would perform the first direct sampling of the lake water had been training for 18 months. When the drill broke through the last few meters of basal ice and the first water samples were drawn, the event was filmed and transmitted, live, to the institute that funded the program and to a small but genuinely excited segment of the planetary science community that had been following the project for years. The samples were extraordinary. The microbial life they contained was unlike anything previously documented. Organisms that had evolved in complete isolation for tens of millions of years, in cold and dark and pressure, metabolizing through pathways that used no sunlight and produced, as byproducts, chemical signatures that one of the exobiology consultants on the project noted, in a private email to a colleague, bore a structural similarity to certain biosignatures identified in the atmospheric spectra of several exoplanets. The note was made in passing. It was not pursued. The lead driller on the winter crew was a Norwegian woman named Sigrid Halvorsen. She had 12 years of experience in polar drilling operations and was known, among her colleagues, for a quality they described as groundedness, an imperturbability under difficult conditions that was less the absence of feeling than it was the very controlled and deliberate management of it. She was the kind of person who, in an emergency, became quieter rather than louder, who did more and said less, whose calmness was not the absence of understanding the severity of a situation but its opposite. A perfect comprehension of it that had been converted, through long practice, into steady and effective action. It was Sigrid who first noticed the sound coming from below the ice. Not from the drill bore, from everywhere. This distinction was important. When she first reported it to the station commander, she was careful to make this clear. It was not coming from the drill hole. It was not a resonance from the equipment. It was coming from the ice itself, from everywhere in the ice at once. A low sound, below the threshold of hearing in the technical sense, experienced as a vibration in the bone rather than a sound in the ear, steady and pulsed, and, after a few days of listening to it with the total bodily attention she brought to everything she did, unmistakably complex. The station's instruments confirmed what her body had told her. There was a low-frequency acoustic signal propagating through the ice sheet from the direction of the lake. It had begun approximately 36 hours after the first drill breakthrough. This frequency was stable. Its amplitude was steady. And its internal structure, when the seismologists on staff began analyzing it, showed the kind of patterning that was not characteristic of geological processes, not the random chaos of ice movement or subsurface thermal activity, but something with regularity and internal variation that sat, uneasily, in the same analytical space as the base 7 signal that Daniel Voss had heard in his shortwave static. The same analytical space as the patterns Margaret Ellery had logged in the frequency. In the Crestwood fields. The team discussed it every evening in the common room, over food that no one was particularly eating, in the complete polar darkness outside every window, in temperatures that made the station feel like a capsule launched into a space that was hostile not through malice but through total indifference to human requirements. They discussed it calmly because Sigrid's calmness was the temperature of the room's emotional atmosphere, because she had set the tone and everyone else was following it, even those who would not have described themselves as frightened but who found that they were sleeping less well than usual and were checking, more frequently than usual, the readings on the drill bore sensors. "It's a response," said the exobiologist on the team, a young woman named Priya who had been the quietest and most technically minded of the group and who was not, generally, given to unqualified statements. "To the drilling, to our entry into the lake." "What kind of something?" asked the station commander. Priya looked at the spectrographic readout of the signal on her laptop screen for a long time before answering. The signal was visual now, translated into a waveform, and its structure was visible in a way that made it harder, rather than easier, to remain calm about. "Not the microbes," she said. "The microbes are single-celled. Single-celled organisms don't produce organized acoustic signals. Whatever is making this sound is more organized than that. Much more organized." The winter wind moved across the station and the ice groaned in the way that ice always groans under enormous pressure and great cold. And under that groan the signal continued, patient and pulsed and complex, rising from the dark water 2 kilometers below them through the enormous weight of ancient ice, arriving in their bones as a kind of knowledge they hadn't asked for and couldn't return. They did not drill further. The protocol they had trained on for 18 months had contained nothing about this contingency, because the contingency they had trained on was microbial, because life in a deep, cold, isolated lake was supposed to be microbial, was supposed to be ancient and simple and slow. There was no protocol for a signal from below. There was no page in the manual for what to do when the thing you have found is not a sample but a sender. Sigrid spent the last 3 weeks of the winter season sitting up late in the common room after the rest of the team had gone to bed. Not because she was afraid. She was not afraid, or not exactly. But because the signal required witnessing, she had decided. Someone needed to be awake and present and paying full attention to it. Someone needed to acknowledge that it was happening. She was not sure why this felt important. She was not a philosophical person, not given to the language of acknowledgement and presence. But she was, above all other things, a person who paid attention, and the signal was the most important thing she had ever encountered in her life, and it deserved the quality of her attention, even if she could not respond to it, even if all she could do was be awake in the dark and let it move through her and know that she was there and that it was there and that the ice between them, for all its 2-kilometer depth and all its 15 million years of darkness, was not, in any fundamental sense, a barrier between two things that were now aware of each other. The replacement crew arrived in October, at the end of the polar winter, on the first flight when the ice runway was solid enough to take weight. There were 12 of them, the regular summer contingent, cheerful and well-rested and arriving with fresh food and news from the world outside, and their energy was the kind of energy that fills a space and changes the temperature of a room the way sunlight changes the temperature of a room, and the 6 winter crew members who had been living with the signal for 3 months found, to varying degrees, that they resented it. Not the people. The energy. The way the energy made the signal seem, suddenly, like a private thing. Like something that did not belong to the incoming day world. Sigrid was the last to leave the station when the winter cruise transport was ready. She spent her last morning walking the perimeter of the station, in full cold weather gear, in a temperature of -47, in a sky that was beginning to admit light again after 3 months of dark. The light was pale and horizontal and made the ice look like the surface of another planet, which it was, in the relevant sense, a place where human biology had no business existing without extensive mechanical mediation, a place that belonged absolutely and without qualification to its own severe and ancient conditions. She could still feel the signal. Even standing outside, even on the surface of the ice, she could feel it in her bones. Quieter than inside, partially masked by the ambient vibration of the wind, but present. Unmistakably present. A pulse from 2 kilometers below, steady as a heartbeat, patient as geology, complex in a way she would carry with her for the rest of her life as a kind of interior knowledge, a frequency in her own body that she would notice in quiet rooms and during moments of stillness, and that she would never fully be able to name or explain to anyone who had not themselves stood on the East Antarctic ice sheet and felt what was below it attending to the world above. She boarded the transport. The plane climbed steeply in the cold, thin air, and she looked down through the small window at the white expanse of the ice sheet, impossibly vast, impossibly white, impossibly old, and thought about what was under it. What had been under it for how long? What continued under it now, producing its low and organized signal, not for her, not because of her, not in any way that made her the point of the thing, but knowing she was there. Registering her presence with the background awareness of something that has been registering presences for longer than the species has existed. Present to her in the way that something very old and very deeply rooted is present to something small and warm and quick that passes over it briefly in the light. Under the oldest ice, in the darkest water, the oldest things wait. They are not sleeping. They have never been sleeping. They simply have a different relationship with time than we do. The replacement. The street where Nadia Kowalczyk had lived for 22 years was the kind of street where everybody knew everybody, not in the intrusive way of a small town, but in the easy, habitual way of a neighborhood that had been stable long enough for its human geography to become as familiar as the physical one. She knew her neighbors the way she knew the particular creak of her own stairs, or the way the light fell differently in the kitchen in October than in any other month. Not because she had studied them, but because they had accumulated in her over years into a texture of knowing that was mostly unconscious and became conscious only when something changed. Gerald Hartley, who lived across the street in the white ranch-style house with the birch trees in the front yard, had gone into the hospital in March for what his wife Patricia described as a cardiac event. He had been there for 3 weeks. His homecoming in early April was the occasion for a brief neighborhood welcome. Patricia had sent a group text, cards had been left, a casserole had appeared on the front steps, and Nadia had, like everyone on the street, been glad that Gerald was home and back on his feet. The thing about Gerald, the thing she could not have explained to anyone and did not try to, was that he was the same and also not the same in a way that had no component she could identify. This is a thing that happens when people return from serious illness. She knew this. She was a nurse. She understood the before and after quality that major medical events imposed on a person, the subtle recalibrations of personality and manner that came from a close encounter with mortality. She had seen it professionally many times. So when she noticed, in the weeks following Gerald's return, that something about him was different, her first and most reasonable hypothesis was that this was simply that. A man who had nearly died, processing the fact of nearly dying, conducting his ordinary life with slightly adjusted settings. But the adjustments were specific, in ways that she kept finding herself cataloging without quite meaning to. Gerald had always been a morning person, always out early to collect his newspaper and exchange brief pleasantries with anyone else who happened to be out, a habitual and comfortable ritual. He was now out later in the day, and when she saw him, his timing in the morning was always the same. Precisely 9:17, which she only knew because she had started, without consciously deciding to, noting it. He moved differently or moved the same but was in the space differently, held himself in relation to the space around him with a quality she finally, weeks later, identified as carefulness. Not the carefulness of a man who had recently been ill. The carefulness of a man who was paying very close attention to performing a role he had not previously needed to perform consciously. He was also watching her. She noticed this gradually and then all at once, in the way you notice something that has been true for a while but that your mind has been quietly declining to fully register. Not aggressively, not uncomfortably, but watching her and watching the neighborhood with a quality of sustained, patient attention that reminded her of something she couldn't immediately name and then did name. One afternoon, standing at her kitchen window watching him water his front lawn with the same mechanical precision he brought to everything now. It reminded her of observation. It reminded her of the specific quality of attention a person brings to a thing they are studying. She told herself this was paranoia. She was a practical woman. She had no framework for what was forming in her mind, no vocabulary for it that didn't require her to sound like something she was not. She continued to wave to Gerald when she saw him. She continued to bring casseroles to Patricia when Patricia seemed to need them, which was often, Patricia being a person who had always needed the social nourishment of gesture and gesture return. Patricia herself was fine, normal. Occasionally she seemed slightly puzzled by something, the way you seem puzzled when a word you know very well suddenly seems to mean less than it always has. But she was fine. She was Patricia. The night that Nadia stopped being able to tell herself the story of paranoia was a Thursday in June. She had been unable to sleep. This had been happening more since Gerald came home. Her sleep had been lighter and more interrupted, though she had not connected the two things until now, and she had gone downstairs for water at 2 in the morning. Standing in her kitchen, in the dark, she looked out the window across the street at Gerald's house. Gerald was standing in his front yard. It was 2:17 in the morning on a June Thursday, and Gerald Hartley was standing in his front yard in a way that was not the way a person stands in their front yard. He was not standing as if he had come outside for air, or to check the sprinkler system, or because he couldn't sleep. He was standing as if standing was the purpose, as if he was at a post. His face was turned slightly upward, not at any particular star but at the sky in general, and he was very still in the way that only extremely good observation requires stillness, the way a scientist is still when they are taking a measurement that requires their own body to become as much like an instrument as possible. Nadia stood at her kitchen window in the dark and looked at him, and he did not move and she did not move, and somewhere in that still June night the understanding that had been forming in her for weeks, slowly and with great reluctance, arrived complete. She did not know what had happened in that hospital. She did not know what Gerald had encountered, or what had encountered him, in the vulnerability of his illness. She did not know whether the Gerald who had come home was Gerald in any meaningful continuity with the Gerald who had gone in. She knew only this. Something was here on her street, in that house, standing in that front yard, that was attending to things she could not see, cataloging and observing with a patience that was not human patience, that was something much longer and much colder than human patience, and that was doing so with the face and the mannerisms and the watering can habits of a man she had known for 22 years. She stepped back from the window. She went back upstairs. She lay in her bed in the dark and looked at the ceiling and breathed carefully, the way you breathe when you are trying not to be the kind of person who requires more oxygen than the room is providing. In the morning, Gerald was out at 9:17 collecting his newspaper, and he waved to her from across the street, and she waved back, and his wave was exactly right. Everything about him was exactly right. The smile, the timing, the slight lift of the newspaper as he turned to go inside. All exactly right. All exactly as she had always known it. She stood in her front doorway and watched him go into his house, and she thought, "This is a very good imitation. This is an imitation so good that it has probably always been good enough for almost everyone who has encountered it." And she thought, whatever is inside that imitation came from somewhere very far away, and it is living in a quiet house on a quiet street in a suburb of a mid-sized American city, and it is watching and taking notes and wearing the face of a man who had a cardiac event in March, and it will be here for as long as it needs to be, collecting whatever it came to collect, standing in the front yard at 2 in the morning and watching the sky with the specific focused attention of something that came from there and has not yet forgotten what it is looking for. The ordinary world has edges. You can go your whole life without finding them. Or you can find them in a neighbor's front yard on a Thursday morning in June. Signal from the Shepherd Moon. The probe had been traveling for 11 years when it passed within observational range of a small, irregularly shaped moon orbiting a gas giant in a star system that the mission planners had selected not as a primary target but as a useful gravitational assist node on the way to somewhere else. The moon was approximately 200 kilometers in diameter, tidally locked to its parent planet, geologically inert by every prior remote sensing assessment, and expected to provide nothing of scientific interest beyond the gravity assist itself and perhaps some supplementary data on the radiation environment in the inner ring system. The mission team was not, therefore, in a state of high anticipation when the probe began its closest approach pass. They were focused on the navigation data, on the precision of the gravity assist trajectory, on the fuel consumption calculations that would determine the next phase of the mission. The instruments that were pointed at the moon were doing so because instruments were always pointed at something, because instrument time was valuable and even an uninteresting moon was more interesting than deep space background, and because the raw data would be archived and available for later analysis if anyone ever wanted it. No one would have wanted it in the ordinary run of things. The moon was a small rock in the dark. The raw data would have sat in an archive on a server somewhere, unanalyzed and uncited for years, perhaps forever, if not for a junior analyst named Tomas Reyes who was assigned to the routine data reduction for the flyby as part of a rotation that was, for him, exactly as unglamorous as it sounded. Tomas had been at the Institute for 3 years. He was 26 years old. He had a tendency to over-examine data that his supervisors had occasionally pointed out as a quality that, in moderation, was an asset and in excess was a liability. He spent too long on things that didn't warrant long spending, they said, and they were usually right. He was aware of this about himself. He tried to manage it. On a Wednesday afternoon in a small open-plan office in a building that smelled of old carpet and institutional coffee, Tomas opened the spectral analysis data from the moon flyby, planning to spend 2 hours on it and file a summary before the end of the day. He spent 19 hours on it. He went home at 2 in the morning and slept for 4 hours and came back and spent another 12 hours on it before he called his supervisor and said, in a voice he was working extremely hard to keep calibrated to the register of mild professional interest rather than something that more accurately reflected what he was experiencing, that he needed a second set of eyes on something. What the spectrometer had found, in a region of the moon's surface that faced permanently away from both its parent planet and its star and therefore lived in a darkness almost absolute, was a thermal signature that should not have been there. Not dramatic, not obvious. A thermal signature that was, in absolute terms, approximately 3 degrees Celsius above the surrounding surface temperature, almost nothing, almost the margin of measurement error, except that it was consistent across multiple instrument passes and internally organized in a way that was thermally inconsistent with any known geological process and consistently organized in a way that was, structurally, very similar to the kind of organized thermal variation that biological processes produced. Not biological. Tomas was careful to be clear about this. He did not use the word biological to his supervisor, or later to the small and quietly incredulous group of senior scientists who convened to look at his data. He used the phrase organized thermal variation with structural similarity to metabolic signatures, which was accurate, which was precise, which was all he could defensibly claim. What he said to his partner that night, at home, over a dinner neither of them ate much of, was different. What he said was, "It's a building, or something that functions like a building. It's something that has been constructed. Someone built something on that moon and it's still warm." His partner, who was a civil engineer and deeply practical, said, "How long has it been there?" Tomas said, "I don't know. I can't know from this data. But the moon is geologically dead. No volcanic activity for at least 3 billion years. Whatever is producing that heat is not geological. It could have been there for—" He stopped. Started again. "It could have been there for a very long time." The data was reviewed by a team of 14 scientists over the following 3 months. None of them found a geological explanation that they were fully satisfied with, though several proposed candidates. None of them publicly used the word artifact, though the word was present in the room every time they met to discuss the data, hovering just above the conversation like a ceiling that everyone was aware of and no one wanted to touch. The decision was made to include the thermal anomaly in the mission's data archive with a notation that it was of uncertain origin and meriting further investigation. This is not a phrase designed to attract attention. It is a phrase designed to be responsible without being inflammatory. The data existed. It was noted. The notation invited future study without making any claims that the present state of the evidence could not support. Tomas filed the notation and moved to the next rotation of data assignments. He did not speak publicly about what he had found or what he believed it might be. He was 26 years old and he had 3 years at the institute, and he understood, with a maturity about the social architecture of science that he had developed early, that some things needed to be said at the right time and in the right way and with the right amount of supporting evidence, and that doing it wrong was worse than not doing it at all. But at night, lying awake in the ordinary dark of an ordinary bedroom in an ordinary city, he thought about it. He thought about a small, dark moon at an enormous distance, geologically dead for 3 billion years, locked in permanent darkness on its inward face, and somewhere on that dark face a structure. Something built, something put there by something with the capacity and the intention to build and put things in places. Still warm. Still warm after God knew how long. Not abandoned. Not cold. Warm the way occupied things are warm. Warm with the residual heat of something ongoing, something not finished, something that was still. At the moment his probe flew past it and his spectrometer registered the 3-degree variation and his algorithms flagged the organized thermal signature in use. Warm the way a house is warm when someone is home. In the cold between worlds, in the dark of locked and airless moons, there may be rooms still lit. There may be things still working. The silence of space is not the silence of absence. The old agreement, the oldest stories in every human culture contain the visitors. This is not a metaphor, and it is not a fanciful construction, and it is not the kind of statement that the academically cautious make without extensive qualification. It is a pattern in the ethnographic and archaeological and oral historical record that has been documented by anthropologists and folklorists and comparative mythologists for over a century, and that is not disputed in its basic form even by scholars who dispute its interpretation. In virtually every culture on Earth, across every continent and every era of recorded and transmitted memory, there are stories of beings from above the sky who came to Earth, who interacted with early humans, who made some form of arrangement with the human communities they encountered, and who left or who are understood to have left or to have become less visible at some point in the past with an understanding, a condition, and agreement about return. The details of the stories vary enormously. The beings described range from luminous to monstrous, from beneficent to terrifying, from godlike in their power and beauty to disturbingly similar to humans in their frailty and error. The arrangements they make with human communities range from gifts of knowledge and technology to demands of tribute and sacrifice to simple and unexplained conditions about specific behaviors, specific places, specific times. The circumstances of their departure or diminishment or transition from visible to invisible are described variously as ascent into the sky, descent into the earth, dissolution into a different mode of being, retreat to a place that exists alongside but not within the visible world, withdrawal pending some future condition being met. What the stories share at their structural core, beneath the enormous variety of cultural detail, is this The relationship is ongoing. The visitors did not come once and leave and are now gone forever. The visitors are absent in the sense that they are not immediately visible, not immediately accessible, not part of the daily operations of ordinary human social life. But they are present in the sense that the conditions of the agreement are still in effect, the relationship is still active, the possibility of contact or return is not historical but current, and the responsibility of the human side of the arrangement, to maintain certain practices, to observe certain prohibitions, to remember and transmit certain knowledge, is still alive and still binding. Thomas Nairn was a 68-year-old ethnographer who had spent 40 years traveling the world and collecting, in the most rigorous way he knew how, the versions of this story as they survived in living oral traditions. He had 53 notebooks and 30 years of audio recordings and a collection of field journals that his graduate students privately referred to as the Archive A, because it occupied 2 filing cabinets in his office and was understood by everyone in his department to be both his life's work and, in some hard-to-articulate way, his life's burden. He had spent his career in an uncomfortable middle position. He was not a believer in the supernatural sense. He had no interest in the ancient astronaut literature, which he found methodologically embarrassing and intellectually ungenerous to the cultures it claimed to discuss. He was also not a debunker. He was not interested in explaining the stories away, in reducing them to metaphor or misunderstanding or the primitive attempt of pre-scientific minds to make sense of natural phenomena. What he was interested in, exclusively, was the stories themselves, their structure, their persistence, their cross-cultural convergences, and the question that he had come to believe was the most important and least asked question in the field. What do the people who carry these stories think they mean? Because the people who carried these stories, the elders and tradition keepers and knowledge holders who had received them through living transmission, not from books or films or the polluted waters of the contemporary discourse about ancient visitors, did not, in his experience, treat them as metaphor or as history in the sense of the distant past. They treated them as current events, as ongoing situations, as something that required their continuous attention and maintenance because the agreement, the old agreement, was still in effect and its terms were still being observed and the question of its fulfillment or non-fulfillment was still open. He had asked, in 53 notebooks and 30 years of interviews, the same question in hundreds of different ways, of hundreds of different knowledge holders. What is the agreement? What are its terms? What is it that we, humans, are required to do or not do under the arrangement? The answers varied, wildly in their specifics, but they shared, at their structural core, the same shape, and the shape was this: the visitors are waiting for something. They are waiting for humans to become something specific, to develop some specific capacity, to reach some specific threshold. The agreement is that they will not make themselves fully known, will not become visible, will not make direct and undeniable contact, until that threshold has been crossed. And the human obligation under the agreement is to remember this, to remember that they are being observed, to remember that contact is conditional on what humanity does with itself over the long arc of its development, to remember that the universe is not indifferent, that the visitors are not absent, that the silence is not emptiness but the particular quality of patience that belongs to things that operate on timescales that make human history feel like an afternoon. Thomas had a private formulation, not publishable in a peer-reviewed journal, not shareable without extensive qualification, that he had developed over 40 years of sitting with this pattern. He called it the observation hypothesis. It was simply this, that the convergent testimony of oral traditions across hundreds of cultures and thousands of years, the testimony of knowledge holders who had no contact with each other and no common source except the lived transmission of what they had been told by those who knew before them, was pointing at something real. Not metaphorically real, not symbolically real, actually real, that there was, and perhaps had always been, a relationship between humanity and something else, something that had made itself known at specific times and in specific ways and had then, for reasons that the traditions variously attributed to human failing or human promise or the completion of some phase of a longer project, withdrawn to observation. That the stories were not about the past. That the stories were a description of the present. That the observers were still here. That the agreement was still in effect. That the threshold was still approaching or receding or perhaps both simultaneously, in the way that certain conditions approach and recede through history like a tide, sometimes very close, sometimes very far, never quite resolving into the moment of contact that everything on both sides of the agreement was, in its own way, oriented toward. He kept this formulation to himself. He was 68 years old and he would retire in a few years, and he had produced, over the course of a career, important and respected work in the field of comparative mythology and oral tradition. He had said what he could say within the bounds of what his field allowed him to say. And the rest, the thing at the center of the archive, the thing that 40 years of sitting with the stories of 53 notebooks had deposited in him like silt, that he kept, carefully and with full awareness of its weight, for the night hours in his study, where the notebooks lived in their filing cabinets and the recordings existed on their drives, and the pattern was as clear to him as his own face in a mirror. Waiting. Everything is waiting. The old agreement holds, and both sides of it are patient, and the universe is large and time is long, and the threshold, whatever it is, has not yet been crossed. And in the meantime the observers observe, and the traditions transmit, and the elders tell the younger ones what the elders were told, and somewhere in the dark between the stars, something very old and very patient moves through its long and incomprehensible work and knows, without needing to check, without needing to verify, that we are here as we have always been here, as small and strange and interesting as we have always been, in this green and temporary world, in this small and specific now. Every culture has the story. Every culture has the elder who still remembers the terms. The agreement has not expired. It has never expired. Sleep now. 8 stories. 8 slow descents into the dark between the stars, into the fields and the lakes and the ice and the stations and the moons and the very old agreements that may or may not govern the terms on which we inhabit this particular planet at this particular moment. I hope you are very sleepy now. I hope your breathing is slow and your muscles are heavy and the room around you has gone soft at the edges in the way it does when the mind begins the long slide toward unconsciousness that we have been making every night of our lives, since the first night after the first day we were alive. You are safe. Whatever you have heard tonight, whatever seeds I have planted in the dark soil of your almost sleeping mind, you are safe right now, in your bed, in your room, in your home. The ceiling above you is a ceiling, not a window. The dark outside your window is ordinary dark, familiar and cool and full of the same small nighttime sounds it has always been full of. Or perhaps the ceiling is a window. Perhaps the dark outside is inhabited in ways we've always half known and never fully named. Perhaps, right now, something in the field is tending. Something at the water's edge is counting. Something in the static is listening. Something beneath the ice is waiting. Perhaps the old agreement holds, and the threshold is close tonight, closer than it has ever been, and something very patient and very far away is watching this small green planet and all its small and strange inhabitants lying down in the dark to sleep, as we have always lain down in the dark to sleep, trusting, without evidence, without reason, with the absolute trust of the very tired, that the morning will come. It will come. The morning always comes. And in the morning the world will look exactly like the world, and the ceiling will be a ceiling, and the corn will just be corn, and the lake will just be a lake, and Gerald from across the street will wave at exactly 9:17 and his wave will be exactly right. But tonight, in the dark, with the universe pressed close against all our windows and the deep frequencies moving through us the way they always move through us, whether we attend to them or not, tonight let yourself feel small. Not diminished. Not afraid. Just small, in the beautiful and particular way of a person lying under a great dark sky, correctly aware of the distance above them and correctly awed by it, and still, somehow, completely and warmly and inexplicably safe. Good night. The dark is enormous. You are small and warm inside it. Something very far away knows you're there. Sleep now.